Hey, you ever just lay awake at night and wonder, like, what happens after we die?
It's a big question, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's something people have been wrestling with forever, right?
Oh, absolutely. Since the dawn of time, I'd say.
Right. And, speaking of timeless questions, you sent us some really interesting stuff about this. Excerpts from this book are The Dead Alive Now
hmm
by, I think it's Victor Paul Wierwille.
That's the one.
Okay, so we're going to kind of dive deep into that with you today, see what Wierwille had to say about, the afterlife and all that.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. So, this whole thing, this isn't just like a religious debate, right?
Yo, not at
I
all.
mean, you've got philosophers going back to what, Socrates and Plato talking about this stuff.
Right. Exactly. I mean, every culture has its own mythology, its own beliefs about death and what comes after. It's a fundamental human question.
Totally. So where does Wierwille fit into all of this? What's his take?
Well, he jumps right in with a pretty bold claim, actually.
Oh, yeah.
He says that the dead, contrary to popular belief, aren't actually conscious in heaven right now.
Whoa, hold on, really?
That's what he says. Instead, they're in this state he calls soul sleep, just kind of waiting for the big resurrection event when Christ returns.
So it's like a giant cosmic nap time.
That's one way to put it.
But, I mean, that really makes you think, like, what does that mean for how we live our lives now? If our loved ones aren't, like, looking down on us or anything.
Right, and that's a really important point, that we're not just talking about some abstract theological concept here. This stuff has real emotional weight.
Absolutely.
And Wierwille, to his credit, he doesn't shy away from that at all. In fact, he says that this understanding should actually make our actions in this life even more meaningful.
Okay, I'm intrigued, but before we get too deep into that, let's rewind a bit. How does Wierwille even back this whole soul sleep idea up? I mean, what about all those Bible verses people point to that seem to suggest, that we are with our loved ones right after death?
That's a great question, and Wierwille actually dedicates a good chunk of the book to addressing those seeming contradictions. He dives right into those gotcha passages, you might call them.
Perfect, because I've got a few gotchas up my sleeve.
Well, fire away. Let's see what we've got.
Okay, so how about this? What about when Paul says, to die is gain? That whole thing in Philippians.
Mm.
Seems pretty straightforward, right?
It does seem that way on the surface, but Wierwille says we need to look at the context, and more importantly, the original language. He points out that the Greek word Paul uses there doesn't necessarily mean death as we think of it, but more like a departure or a going home to be reunited later.
Mm. So not about the moment of death, but the eventual reunion.
Precisely, or at least that's how Wierwille interprets it.
Okay, I can kind of see where he's going with that. But what about the story of Lazarus? The rich man and Lazarus.
Ah, yes, that's a vivid one.
Right, Lazarus is hanging out with Abraham. The rich man is suffering. Doesn't get much clearer than that.
It's definitely a powerful image, but here's the thing. Wierwille argues it's not meant to be taken literally. He reminds us that it's a parable, a story Jesus used to challenge the Pharisees' beliefs about the afterlife, not a literal blueprint of heaven and hell. So, Jesus was using familiar imagery. But Wierwille says the real point he was making is that the final judgment, the true reward or punishment, happens after the resurrection, not immediately.
Okay, so context is key here. It's like he's saying we can't just pull verses out of thin air without looking at the big picture.
Exactly. And that actually leads us to one of Wierwille's most intriguing arguments, and honestly, kind of a head-scratcher.
Okay, I'm ready. Hit me with it.
He uses the story of King Saul and the Witch of Endor as a prime example of what he calls demonic impersonation.
Okay, now demonic impersonation, you're going to have to break that one down for me.
So picture this. You've got King Saul facing a losing battle, desperate for guidance. God's not answering his prayers, so he does something totally forbidden. He seeks out a medium, the Witch of Endor, to summon the spirit of the prophet Samuel, who's dead.
Talk about a spooky seance. So does Samuel's ghost actually show up?
Well, something claiming to be Samuel appears. This figure gives Saul a prophecy of doom and gloom, and spoiler alert, things don't end well for Saul. But here's where Wierwille goes out on a limb. He says this wasn't actually Samuel at all, but a demonic impersonation, an illusion cooked up by Satan himself.
Whoa, like a demonic deepfake. That's some next-level trickery. So how does he think Satan pulled this off? Is Wierwille talking about, like, possession or something?
Not quite. Wierwille says Satan's sneakier than that, doesn't need to actually possess anyone to create this kind of illusion. He's saying Satan, being, a master of deception, after observing Samuel his whole life, would have picked up enough to basically create a replica.
So it's like Satan had this whole file on Samuel, all his quirks, his mannerisms, everything.
Exactly, like a cosmic dossier ready to go. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets really interesting. Wierwille says this isn't just about this one spooky story, right? He's using this to make a point about spiritual deception in general.
Okay, now that's a bit unnerving, not gonna lie. Does he give us any tips on, like, how to avoid that, how to know what's real, what's not?
That's the thing. He doesn't really offer a simple answer there. It's more like he's pushing for, I don't know, a healthy skepticism, I guess. Even in our spiritual experiences, we got to examine our assumptions, look at the evidence, not just blindly accept things.
Huh, so it's like trust but verify, but on a cosmic scale.
You got it.
Okay, so how does this whole demonic impersonation thing tie back into his main argument about soul sleep?
It's all connected. See, Wierwille's point is if the dead were actually conscious in heaven, right there with God, why would Satan even need to bother with this whole charade? Why bother faking Samuel if the real deal's just hanging out in paradise?
So he's saying these impersonations, it's Satan trying to maintain his influence, keep us focused on this earthly plane instead of the real hope of resurrection.
That's the gist of it, yeah. And it's a pretty bold claim when you think about it. Like, our traditional view of heaven reuniting with loved ones, he's saying that might actually be playing into Satan's hand.
Wow. Okay, so let's say, just for argument's sake, that we accept this whole premise. The dead aren't conscious, they're in soul sleep. What does that mean for us here and now? Like, how should that change our perspective on life, on faith, even on how we deal with grief?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, right? How do you grieve if you don't believe your loved one is, like, in a better place already?
Right. That's where I think some of the emotional implications of this belief really come into focus.
For sure. In Wierwille, he doesn't dismiss the pain of loss or anything. He still acknowledges that grief is real, it's important, but he encourages us to kind of see it through this lens of hope. Hope for a future reunion, a future awakening.
So it's not that our loved ones aren't at peace. It's that their ultimate peace is still coming.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Man, it's a lot to wrap your head around.
It really is. It's a very different way of thinking about death and the afterlife.
But you know what's interesting is even with all this talk of soul sleep and waiting, there's also this sense of like urgency, almost like a call to action in Wierwille's writing. Like we're not just supposed to sit around and wait.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's, I think, where his emphasis on evangelism really comes in.
Right, because if people haven't, made their peace with God before they die, and they're not in heaven yet,
then there's this limited window of opportunity to share that message, to maybe impact their eternal fate.
whoa. So it's almost like every conversation, every interaction takes on this whole other level of importance.
Exactly. And Wierwille, he uses this really powerful analogy. He says that those who've grasped this truth are like a man who has discovered his neighbor's house is on fire and races to awaken him.
Wow. Yeah, that definitely paints a picture. Okay, so to bring it all back around, we've gone through a lot here. We've talked about soul sleep, demonic impersonation, the urgency of evangelism. If we had to distill all of this down to like one big takeaway, one thing for our listeners to really chew on, what would it be?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think for me, it comes back to that idea of perspective, right? Wierwille is really challenging us to look at life, death, the whole shebang through a different lens. And whether or not you agree with all his conclusions, you have to admit, he makes you think. He forces you to confront some really big questions.
Absolutely. And that's kind of the point of these deep dives, right? We're not here to give you all the answers, but to get you thinking, get you asking those questions.
Exactly. It's about starting a conversation, encouraging people to dig deeper, do their own research, and come to their own conclusions.
Because at the end of the day, this whole thing, this question of what happens after we die, it's deeply personal.
Very much so. We all come to it with our own, our own experiences, our own beliefs, and probably some fears too.
And Wierwille's just offering one perspective, one way of grappling with these age-old mysteries. And for me, the most powerful thing he does is that call to action, that sense of purpose he injects into this whole conversation.
Right. It's not just about passively waiting for something to happen. It's about actively living your life in light of what you believe.
Exactly. So as you go about your day, think about this. What do you believe happens after we die? And how does that belief shape the way you're living your life right now in this moment?